hi everybody. Thank you for joining. This is our Housing 101, where you're going to learn a lot of stuff about housing in LA. So I really hope that you all will learn something useful for where you're going, what you're doing, and we'll be ready to help us do what we got to do to get more affordable housing, because it's very, very, very much necessary and needed and underdeveloped. So this is Luke. Luke is our education director, and he knows all the stuffs. So he's going to be our presenter for this Housing 101. If you'd like to take it away, Luke, please do.
Great, thanks so much. Good now afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this Saturday afternoon to learn a little bit more about housing here in LA. I am Luke Clip. I am the education director for About Housing LA, but I do that in a volunteer capacity. I actually have a day job. This is something that I do because I care a lot about housing and I want to do what I can in my own capacity to help address our ongoing housing crisis. So I just want to be clear as we dive in here. We blocked off here 2 hours. This presentation will take most of that. Will take about 90 minutes. So if you have questions, the things that come up, unless it's something that's really pressing, really urgent, if you don't mind holding on to them till the end, some of these questions come up, especially earlier on in the presentation, that kind of get answered as we move along. So I encourage you to be thinking about stuff as we're going through this. Really sort of let this sort of marinate, and then when we get to the end, we'll have all time permitting, we'll have somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes for Q&A. This is a primer. This is not intended as like a housing 201 or a 301. There's a lot of stuff we could do a deep dive into, as you'll see in this presentation. We're really going to focus a lot here on the history that sort of shapes our present in our housing systems, housing policy. So there's a lot we could go into here, right? This housing is an incredibly complex topic. And I think, frankly, someone could be, you could get your PhD in housing policy and still have more to study after 8 years of getting a PhD, right? Like, there is just so much to this, and we've only got a couple hours this afternoon. So really, I'm just trying to offer some key ideas and things to be thinking about as you get to get involved and active in this space around housing policy. My day job is in transportation policy, but I do a lot of stuff within the housing realm. I've been actually pretty active in my local community, including on my neighborhood council for a few years, and I've been involved in a number of, let's call them housing fights. I don't think the fight is the right word, but this is how it seems to always sort of shake out, is it ends up becoming that way. But in any case, I've been involved in this space for a number of years, and happy to sort of share from my own experience as well as the stuff that I've studied, which a lot of the stuff we'll be sharing here today is things that I've been sort of learning and picking up along the way. So in terms of our agenda, we're going to spend most of our time going over the housing history for LA. It really is, we're going to go through the last century, which maybe sound a little daunting, but we're just going to really sort of move through that and then see how that really shapes our present environment. We'll spend very short little bit of time talking about our region, Abundant Housing LA's theory of change and recommended policy approaches, and then ways you can get involved before we have some time at the end for Q&A. I offer this slide here. This is St. Joseph's Hospital in Superior, Wisconsin. I offer this because this was a building that was built in the 1930s and shuttered in the 1970s. My family lived here for a little over a year in the 1980s after it was an abandoned facility, along with some other folks who were functionally homeless. And I share that because I think we all come to this housing conversation with different experiences. And while, as we'll see, I am someone who is inordinately privileged in this space as a white man, who has a great deal of more access to housing as a result of that. Each one of us, this is intensely personal for different reasons, right? So I want to make sure that we're clear, like, as we talk about policy, we talk about systems, whatever, we each have our own different experiences of things that may be validated by that or may feel invalidated by that. I don't want us to it's important to sort of be able to look at the policy, look at the systems, and really just kind of accept some of these things and then to start to figure out how to change them, and recognize that we all, because housing is such a personal and intense thing, that it can feel very difficult to sort of peel back the layers without sort of getting very personally involved. And I appreciate that. And I just sort of want to encourage us all to sort of be thinking about how our own individual histories shape our experience as it relates to this conversation. There's a few core ideas, core central ideas, let's call them, that are really essential to this presentation today. The first is what I will call here banning multifamily housing. But really what we often hear is single family housing. Single family housing means one thing. It means that no matter the size of a piece of land, whether it's 1/10 of an acre, a half an acre, 10 acres, whatever the size of the piece of land, you can only put one house on that piece of land. That's what single family housing means. That's it. One house on that piece of land. And that house could be 500 square feet, 50,000 square feet. It can only be one house. It can't be used as a place where multiple families or multiple generations of a family, or individuals can be renting rooms. It cannot be any of those things. It has to be a family on a house on a piece of property, no matter the size of the property. And that approach to housing, where we are so constricted in how we allow people to sort of share in the costs and opportunities associated with land, which is incredibly in places like Southern California, as I put it here, leads to wealth and opportunity disparities, unaffordable rents, homelessness, and you name it. There's so many different pieces of the puzzle that are tied directly into how we make it so difficult to create housing here, in no small part because the vast majority of our land we have set aside for single family zoning, or I should say we have banned multifamily housing on the vast majority of our land. The second central idea of this presentation today is that our housing policy is systemically racist and has been for a very, very long time, for at least a century, as we will see. And in fact, where some people might want to at least feel like, well, it's getting better, right? It must be getting better. We're actually seeing that outcomes are more systemically racist today than they have been in the last 40 years. So things have actually gotten worse in terms of outcomes that can only be explained by race. The third central idea is we need to really distinguish between the opinions that are individual opinions and institutional opinions. For instance, I just described single-family zoning as banning multifamily housing. Well, that's my individual opinion, but the institutional opinion is what's called single-family zoning, single-family residential, and that is in this map here. What this map is showing is that over 70%, almost 75% of all of our residentially zoned land in Southern California is zoned for single family housing, is banning multifamily housing. That's all the pink area you see on this map of Southern California. All the blue areas, those are residentially zoned areas that allow for multifamily housing. I just want to make clear though, like, I have opinions. You have opinions. We all have opinions about things. Those are individual opinions. In some cases, institutions back those opinions up with their institutional weight, whether it's through some policy or funding or all of the above. We need to distinguish between what those things are, because just because a person comes into a space and has an opinion about something does not actually mean it's changing or it's structurally sort of integrated into how we approach housing policy. And the last central idea is that this is not working, and I'm going to show you what I mean by this.
There are a bunch of people around here with cameras. I don't want our neighborhood to be a viral event because of stupidity on a number of people's parts. Andrew, any questions, comments? You.
Yeah, why aren't you building this in Pondview in Montville, New Jersey?
Also about the public subsidy. There is zero public subsidy in this project. This is private investment in your neighborhood. of your passion and the way that you want to protect your neighborhood. And I respect that deeply, right? Really.
Again, what
Folks, quiet, please. Quiet, please.
This project can bring a significant amount, while it's a small portion of the housing that we're proposing, it's a significant amount of affordable housing, which everybody needs.
Folks, quiet down, please.
I just want to reiterate that we're talking about providing affordable housing with no public subsidy.
We don't need it. We don't need it.
Next member of the committee is John Morano. John, that's enough. I don't know. Is it going to be?
If this is so wonderful, why isn't it being built in New Jersey, where they live?
Andrew.
Presentation.
Well, I hope no one has been triggered by that like I kind of am, because I've been in many meetings like that. I want to just sort of pull out a couple things from that, which are themes we hear a lot when it comes to the housing conversation. You heard folks saying build it in New Jersey. This was a meeting of the Bronx Community Board 10, which is essentially a version in New York of their neighborhood, of what we have in Los Angeles, what we call neighborhood councils. They have community boards in New York City. And in the Bronx, Community Board 10 held this meeting just a couple months ago regarding some housing developments that are being proposed there that would add across 4 different buildings about 340 new homes, a number of which would be designated as affordable. This is a community where the average home price in the last decade has doubled. And, you know, if you've been to any community meeting here in LA where we've been talking about housing policy, you've probably heard exactly the same things. And the thing is that this is what we hear everywhere. This isn't just New York. It's not just Los Angeles. It's not just other parts of California. This is the conversation everywhere anytime new housing is proposed. We don't need it. They'll live somewhere else. They should go somewhere else. And then you have, like in this case, the well-meaning planner sitting up there saying, oh, but look, we're doing this without any public subsidy. And they say, we don't care. This is what happens in our housing conversation over and over and over again, and I would argue it is precisely why we're in the circumstances we are in today. So, I said we would dive into our history. You don't need to memorize or learn any of this right now, but I want to show you it because this is what we're going to go through. And really, from this timeline, the main thing, because we're going to touch on almost all these things in the individual slides coming up, but the main thing I want to tease out from this timeline on this chart, or excuse me, on this slide, are the 3 bars. There's the brown bar to the left, the red bar in the center, and the orangish bar toward the right along the timeline. The brown bar toward the left, that's the period where we had explicitly racist policies and approaches, where we denied people housing on the basis of their race without any issues, or excuse me, with any legal challenges to that. Like it was perfectly legal to do that for several decades. The red bar is where we have what I call implicitly racist policy approaches, where the racism is there. It's just one layer removed. It's there. If you just look underneath the surface just a little bit, it's all right there, but it's not as blunt and obvious. And then the orangish bar to the right is, as you know, the explicitly racist policies were disallowed, and then the implicitly racist policies were starting to be challenged and start to face some issues. What we did and then instead was what I'm calling this period of constriction, where we implemented significant exclusionary zoning, which has since perpetuated all of the outcomes that we developed and created over generations of explicit and implicit racist policies. So we've had this sort of trajectory where you used to allow for a lot more housing, but it was very prescriptive in terms of who could live where on the basis of race, very explicitly and then implicitly. And then as that sort of came out of favor, we just downzoned the heck out of everything. So let's just sort of look at our housing history here, beginning with A quote here from a book called Bound for Freedom, Black Los Angeles and Jim Crow America by Douglas Flaming, where he says that the now classic view holds that from the late 1880s to about 1910, African Americans found LA to be a fairly open city. But after 1910, real estate restrictions on blacks increased and were difficult to surmount. And as the historian Lawrence DeGraff wrote, African Americans, quote, could and did live throughout the city and were much less concentrated in any one area in 1890 and 1900 than they would be after 1910. In the words of Charlotta Bass, the Negro settlers who were the first arrivals bought land and built beautiful homes in all sections of the city, free from restrictions. But then came the Southern whites, and blacks faced the old terror of racial hatred they had tried to forget. So there was this period of time, about 30 years, where black folks were buying and building homes in LA throughout the city and not concentrated in any one particular community of the city. That is obviously no longer the case. Here we are over a century later. And how did we get to that point? Well, for starters, there was a Supreme Court case 105 years ago called Buchanan v. Warley. This was a case where the city of Louisville, Kentucky, had zoning that said, here's the black community, here's the white community in their city zoning codes. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't actually zone on the basis of race. You can't have city laws that say, here's the white community, here's the black community. So the Supreme Court outlawed that explicit race-based zoning. However, housing covenants and deed restrictions and implicit zoning were already well established at this point, and those would continue for decades. And how did we do that? Well, here in Los Angeles, we were one of the first adopters of single-family zones. We adopted in the early 1920s. Actually, the city that first did it in California was Berkeley, California. We adopted it here in LA just a couple of years later. These were homes marketed to and restricted to white households only. Got a couple pamphlets here from Hollywoodland and Eagle Rock. Eagle Rock says the residents of Eagle Rock are all of the white or Caucasian race. Hollywoodland is a little more subtle about it. They say you can protect your home by procuring at today's prices a home place in the hills of Hollywoodland, secured by fixed and natural restrictions against the inroads of metropolitanism. What did they mean by that? The natural restrictions, you can see that in the photo. It's the hills. It's the distance to go where you need to have a car. The fixed restrictions, those are the covenants. Those are the deed restrictions which say only white folks can purchase land here. Only white folks can have the homes resold to them, etc. So that Hollywoodland sign that we all look up to today here in LA, the original purpose of that sign was to advertise a whites-only community. And in case you're thinking, well, maybe the fixed restrictions aren't that clear, I would note that to ensure that restrictive covenants could be enforced, the LA Realty Board financed the case that set a national precedent in 1919, just prior to the city of LA adopting single-family zoning across all the city, where the Supreme Court of California ruled that an African American could buy a covenanted home, but they could not live in it. So in other words, as soon as it became very clear from the courts that covenants and deed restrictions were perfectly legal in 1919, we adopted single-family zoning across the land, and LA allowed this to proliferate everywhere. This was how we created segregated communities starting in the 1920s. And in case you were thinking, well, maybe that's just California, it's not. Corrigan v. Buckley in 1926, just 9 years after the U.S. Supreme Court said you can't zone on the basis of race. In Corrigan v. Buckley, they said, but you can have racially restrictive covenants enforced by law. They also, in that same year, the same Supreme Court upheld zoning of separating uses, in which they called apartments, quote, parasites interfering with the free circulation of air and monopolizing the rays of sun, which would otherwise fall upon the smaller homes. This is also the same court that a year later would endorse eugenics and forced sterilization as a means of population control. So this is a very specific era and time, but the Supreme Court is saying, you can't zone on the basis of race, but you can basically do everything else when it comes to housing to segregate our communities across the land. So here in Los Angeles, the 1920s were actually a prolific era of construction, the most new homes we created in a single decade in the city's history. And in a single year, in 1923, we constructed nearly 44,000 new homes in 1 year. To give you a little bit of perspective, this is the chart on the lower right for the last 4 decades from 1980 to 2020, scaled to the same level as the chart on the left. There has not been a single year in the last 3 decades in which we've constructed more than 16,000 new units of housing across the city of Los Angeles. And yet in the 1920s, we surpassed that in most years of that 1 decade. So that just gives you a little bit of perspective. You look in the 1990s on this chart in the very bottom right-hand side, we're building less housing for almost an entire decade in the city of Los Angeles than we did at the height of the Great Depression, the most economically constricted era in our nation's history. We were still building as much housing as we did for almost an entire decade in the 90s, right? So that should give you some idea of just how little housing we've been building in Los Angeles for the last several decades. Now, fast forward from the 1920s to the early 1930s, we have the Great Depression, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt gets elected president and brings us the New Deal. And one of the key components of the New Deal was the National Housing Act of 1934. We were seeing a great deal of new, what they called Hoovervilles under President Hoover. If the idea of lots of homeless encampments seems new to you, we've had this happen in the past with the Hoovervilles of the late 1920s, early 1930s under the Great Depression. And it was the very first time the federal government stepped in on the subject of housing with the National Housing Act of 1934. This was, I will say, in my estimation, the single largest affordable housing program ever in the history of this country. But not just an affordable housing program, but the one time where we've enabled the accumulation of wealth for folks as part of an affordable housing program, which contrasts sharply with our current affordable housing programs, which do not allow for the accumulation of wealth. Because as soon as you start to earn more income in our current affordable housing programs, you are no longer qualified to remain in that affordable housing. But that was not how we did this in 1934 with the National Housing Act, which key to that act was the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, who then was empowered to create a mechanism to subsidize mortgages. So a lot of folks, if you've ever thought about buying a home, or you've bought a home, or you've ever heard about buying a home, you've probably heard of the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. That is a creature and a creation of the National Housing Act, because the 30-year fixed rate mortgage did not exist prior to the federal government stepping in with the creation of the National Housing Act and the Federal Housing Administration. Prior to this national effort, if you wanted to purchase a home, you could. If you wanted a mortgage, you could get one, but it was very, very difficult to get anything more than a 10 or 15-year mortgage, because it was all private banks. It was all private lending, private financing, and who's to say what kind of job you're going to have 10 or 15 years from now, what the level of risk is associated with lending to someone in this environment. However, the federal government steps in with the National Housing Act, says we will subsidize mortgages. This federal government will federally subsidize 30-year fixed rate mortgages. However, if they're going to do that, they have to assess risk. They have to have an idea of, is this safe to give a mortgage for 30 years in this community? So they empowered the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, who then went to the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or HOLC, no test on this after this presentation, by the way, to determine levels of risk across every community in the country. And the HOLC did just that and came up with maps that looked like this map. This is the map for the Los Angeles area, south of the Santa Monica Mountains, the Basin area, with areas colored 4 different colors. There's green, blue, yellow, and red. These are the maps that we infamously know today as redlining. If you were looking to purchase a home with a federally backed mortgage, 30-year fixed rate mortgage, you would only be able to do that in a green or blue area on this map. You might be able to in a yellow area. It would take some work. It would be difficult, but in a green or blue, it was good to go. In a red area, it was not possible. So areas that were redlined were denied federally subsidized mortgage investments for generations. And these things compounded on each other. It wasn't just the housing. That dictated who lived in a community, how a community had its wealth, how much wealth was invested in that community. Then cities would see how these, it would shape all these other things. So these maps are essentially what shape today's environment when it comes to housing. And these were created whole cloth using some assessment tools to determine levels of risk in the mid-1930s. So let's look at a couple examples of what was said to determine what the color code was for a couple communities. And I'll look, because they're pretty close to each other, I'm looking at an area here I've just circled in green that is right next to Runyon Canyon, and an area in red that's just a mile away in central Hollywood. So the green area next to Runyon Canyon was described at the time as having business and professional men, executives and capitalists and motion picture stars with incomes of $3,600 a year and upward, 0% foreign families, no nationalities, 0% Negro, and no apparent or anticipated shifting or infiltration. This is the top line description. These are the very first few things used to describe this community and why it got the rating it did. The bottom of the same page goes on to say that provisions protect against subversive racial hazards. So what does that mean? Those provisions, those are the covenants. Those are the deed restrictions that I was talking about previously that the courts had upheld as legally enforceable. Those existed across this community, and that is a key reason that this was given a green indication. And as you can see in the bottom of this description, population is homogeneous. For the Homeowners Loan Corporation, a homogeneous community is a community with very low risk. In contrast, the area in central Hollywood that was redlined was described as having white-collar workers, movie and radio employees, service workers, artisans with incomes of $1,200 to $2,000 a year, 15% foreign families, Orientals and Mexicans, a few percent Negro, shifting or infiltration of Orientals increasing, encroachment of business and industry, also a threat. They go on to say that the population is extremely heterogeneous and includes many subversive racial and social elements. And then even further down the page here, they say, were it not for a scattering of Japanese and Filipino residents, this section would be entitled to a higher grade. The area as a whole is assigned a medial red grade. I'm just going to reiterate here that the reason this got a red and not a yellow was a scattering of Japanese and Filipino residents in this community. And this holds throughout the maps across the country and certainly here throughout Los Angeles. That having just a few percent, 5% Negro in a community, having this, what they describe here as a scattering of Japanese and Filipino residents, these are the reasons that areas were redlined throughout Southern California. These are the reasons people could not purchase homes with federally backed mortgages and make long-term investments in their communities. So in 1948, so these maps are law land, by the way, starting in the mid-1930s for several decades to come. But in 1948, while redlining is still the law of the land, while we've still got the housing covenants and deed restrictions, we see some cases percolating up regarding those housing covenants. And one in particular, Hattie McDaniel, who was the first Black winner of an Academy Award for her role as Mammy in Gone with the Wind in 1939. She bought a home in the community of Sugar Hill in South LA, where she ended up having to fight white residents in court to overturn racially restrictive covenants. The white residents who were in the community took her to court. She fought them, and she won. In 1945, it was the very first time that a court ruled against racially restrictive covenants. It was not, however, until several years later that the Supreme Court would also rule against the legal enforceability of these covenants. Now, there's a key detail here, though. It's not like they just went away. So the Supreme Court's ruling was 6-0 of a 9-person court. 3 of the justices, the 3 who did not vote, did not do so because they lived in homes with housing covenants, with racially restrictive deed restrictions, and therefore recused themselves. And furthermore, as you can see with the subheader on the page, on the right side of the page, the highest court refused to declare that these restrictions were invalid. So they, in other words, said, look, you can't enforce them in the court of law, but you can have them. You can still have them. So what ends up happening is extrajudicial mechanisms of enforcement. For instance, in the valley, in the San Fernando Valley, there was only that their covenants and other efforts that followed meant that between 1950 and 1960, throughout the entire San Fernando Valley, the San Fernando Valley Fair Housing Council knew of only 1 Black family able to find a home in an entire decade after the courts had ruled that racially restrictive covenants, deed restrictions were no longer legally enforceable. So fair to say that these were not the only way, but they were a key way that housing was restricted and segregated on the basis of race. So even though the U.S. Federal Housing Administration was stepping in and backing 30-year mortgages starting in the mid-1930s, that still didn't. There were still a lot of folks who were unable to afford housing. So in the late 1930s, starting in the late 1930s, the federal government starts actually building housing, starts becoming a landlord, starts building public housing. However, this was also segregated housing, and it was reinforced by decisions made in Congress in the late 1940s that kept it segregated for decades more to come. So even though the federal government is stepping in and building housing for lower income, middle income Americans, it's still segregated on the basis of race. And in California in 1950, we amended our state constitution with a bill that was put on the ballot by the California Association of Realtors that required that all publicly funded housing has to be approved by the voters. So this is still on the books. This is still in the state constitution, requiring that any publicly funded housing needs to go before the voters to be approved. Now, we have found ways in California over the decades since to get approval, sort of pre-approval, to have sort of an envelope, if you will, sort of a pre-approved number of units that could, of a publicly funded housing that could be built. But that still requires campaigns. It still has a cost associated with it. And that the existence of this amendment in the state constitution still adds anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000 per unit of publicly funded housing to construct it. And from a 2019 LA Times article, the LA Times said that LA officials believe that without a vote in the coming years to remove Article 34 from the Constitution, or to add more housing into the city's portfolio, the city will no longer be able to finance such projects, even though we have the money to do it. So we can't just say more public funding if it makes it that much more difficult to actually build it, because Article 34 is still in our Constitution. Now, there have been efforts to put this before the voters to strike Article 34 from the state constitution. It is likely going to be on the ballot in 2024. However, it has been on the ballot twice before and failed both times. So this is not a given that the state of California voters will strike Article 34 from our Constitution. And in the meantime, it makes the construction of new publicly funded housing inordinately expensive. And at the time, in 1950, it functionally ended the construction of publicly funded housing for many, many years. And then, starting in the early 1950s, we see an era that is often described as white flight. In LA County, we have 88 cities, over 30 of them incorporated in a single decade from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s. Almost all, not exclusively, but almost all, with single-family homes and with a focus on local control. Local control. There were three things that enabled this rapid growth of communities across LA County. And the first I will quote from Richard Rothstein, the author of the book Color of Law, where he says, quote, "Builders went to the Federal Housing Administration and submitted plans for development for the community of Lakewood. Those plans had to include a commitment never to sell a home to an African American. The Federal Housing Administration required in the early 1950s a commitment that every single one of these homes in this new community of Lakewood would have a clause in every deed prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans." So the first thing that enabled white flight in this era was this infusion of resources from the federal government that was contingent on racially restrictive deed covenants, which were already no longer legally enforceable, but the federal government required it as a matter of providing financing to build new housing. The second thing that really enabled this era of white flight, which we'll talk more about in a minute, was our rapidly expanding freeway network. And the third was this idea of contract cities. Contract cities are a creature of the time, did not exist prior to the early 1950s. Prior to that time, if a city incorporated, they needed to stand up their own fire department, their own police department, their own libraries, etc., etc. But then this was actually the city of Lakewood again. It decided to contract with the sheriff for policing, with county fire for fire department, with county libraries for their library. And that was something that they were challenged in the courts on using that approach, and they won. And when the city of Lakewood won, a bunch of other cities adopted the same model. It was a lot easier, right? As a city, all you're doing then is collecting the property taxes and then contracting out for all these things. You're not actually in the business of standing up all of these departments, all of these services internally. You just contract out with the existing county services or wherever the services may be, and you don't have to actually stand it up internally within your city. So we have now a number of contract cities. This was the third thing that really enabled this proliferation of new cities incorporated in this span of white flight. I mentioned the freeway network. We will talk a little more about this as we go through here, but I think one thing that's really important to acknowledge is that it's not like the freeways have always been there and there wasn't stuff there before. We displaced tens of thousands of people to construct our freeway network. And the main thing that really enabled this rapid growth of the freeway network was the Federal Highway Act of 1956, where the federal government said for every dollar you spend locally, we'll give you $9. So 90% of all of our freeway projects were paid for by federal dollars. Once the federal government came in and said, we'll give you all this money to build freeways, guess what? We built freeways. We said, great, you want to fund all of our freeways? We'll build them. And that involved tearing out tens of thousands of homes, displacing tens of thousands of people across Southern California to construct our freeway network. And one of those communities, which is, this is just a Google Maps image, street view, to show you just an a freeway interchange, right? This is just a bridge over the 10 freeway. And we think, well, so what, right? So what about this freeway? Well, we talked briefly earlier about Hattie McDaniel, right, who purchased a home in Sugar Hill, which was a community, one of the nation's wealthiest communities of mostly black residents from the 1940s onward, thanks to Hattie McDaniel and others who were pioneers in purchasing these beautiful palatial mansions in this community. It was bulldozed in the 1960s for the construction of the I-10 freeway. It was also, the I-10 freeway was also constructed right through the heart of the black community in the city of Santa Monica. Now, you might think, well, that's just where they had to build it. No, they had choices, and they chose to do it this way. Now, Hattie McDaniel's home is still standing. There's actually a couple mansions that are still standing in the community of Sugar Hill. But the majority of Sugar Hill is exactly what you're looking at here on this image, which is a freeway. So you might be thinking, well, we've got to be doing stuff to try and change these laws to make them less explicitly racist. Well, yes. And here in California, we passed a bill at the state level in 1963 known as the Rumford Fair Housing Act, named after the legislator who brought the bill forward. Initially, when he brought the bill forward, it said you cannot discriminate on the basis of race in the provision of any housing. However, that was not going to be able to get through the legislature, in that form. So he had to have it amended to have it apply only to buildings of 5 or more units. Hold that number in your head for a minute. 5 or more units. In other words, it didn't apply to single-family homes, duplexes, or what I'll call quadplexes, which is something you can actually see in a fair amount of communities in LA, where it's you have a small apartment building where it's 2 apartments down below and 2 apartments up above. Only buildings of 5 or more apartments would have the Rumford Act apply to them. Well, this was too much for Californians. And in 1964, 1 year after the passage of the Rumford Act, we had Proposition 14 to overturn the Rumford Fair Housing Act. Proposition 14, you can see the ballot description, or excuse me, the brochure description on the left. It says it will restore to California property owners the right to choose the person or persons to whom they wish to sell or rent their residential property. It will abolish those provisions of the Rumford Forced Housing Act of 1963, which took from Californians their freedom of choice in selling or renting their residential property. We might be wondering, what freedom of choice they're talking about? The freedom to discriminate on the basis of race, because that is all the Rumford Housing Act changed. That's what they're talking about without talking about it. And guess what? Californians approved Proposition 14, 65%. 65% in favor of Proposition 14. In Los Angeles County, we voted for it 70%. 70% of Angelenos in LA County voted in favor of reinstating discrimination on the basis of race in all housing in our state. Now, Proposition 14 would be challenged. And Governor Pat Brown at the time said, there's no way I can allow this to go. So I'm taking this to court. Governor Pat Brown, who was quite popular at the time, well, he lost to Ronald Reagan as a result of taking on Proposition 14. And Ronald Reagan, before he was even sworn in, said, you know what? I'm going to repeal the Rumford Open Housing Act. So in case you were wondering what led to the rise of a B-movie actor who then went on to become the president of the United States and essentially completely changed the dynamics of our national politics for generations, it was out of this fight over discrimination on the basis of race in housing. So if you're thinking housing seems to really light up a lot of people and get them really energized, that's not new. That's not new, and it has been very much the case for many, many years. As it would turn out, the Rumford Housing Act, or excuse me, Prop 14, was overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1967. And at the time, that was seen as, that was sort of the forebear to what we would see happen just a year later. But I would just note that the LA Times, they endorsed Prop 14, saying one of man's most ancient rights in a free society is the privilege of using and disposing of his private property in whatever manner he deems appropriate. So the fight over discriminating on the basis of race in housing has a very vivid and dark, I would say, history here in California. At the same time that we're having this fight over discriminating on the basis of race with the Rumford Fair Housing Act, we start to see what I call this period of constriction. Many of us have seen buildings. If you've been around central LA, you've seen these buildings like the one I've shown here on this slide that has the name La Traviata. You might think, well, gosh, if you've ever seen them, like they almost all seem like they were built at the same exact time. They look like something out of like the Brady Bunch era, right? Like they've always got this like 60s font. They might have some like 60s motif or 50s thing. You might wonder, well, where are the newer ones? Why do they all look like they're from a very specific era? Well, that's because they are. That's because we made them illegal to build. Because what happened here is that right around the time that the boom started to build these dingbats, as they're often affectionately known for folks in the housing space, we increased our parking minimums to 1.25 parking spaces per unit. Now, you know, that might seem like, well, what is that? What does that mean? Well, you know, for the purposes of building these dingbats, architects who would design them would work backward. They'd see a piece of property, someone who owned a piece of property with a house on, they say, I want to build an apartment building on my property. Go to an architect, and the architect say, great, you have X number square feet of land and this much of street frontage. That means we can fit this many parking spaces on your property. That means we can build this many apartments, right? Now, these were buildings. I told you to hold on to, or encourage you to hold on to the number of 5, right? Remember, the Rumford Open Housing Act applied to properties of 5 or more units. More often than not, these were 5 or more units, right? Dingbats most often are 7, 8, 10 units of housing. So all of these buildings, which were getting built in large quantities in the late 1950s and early 1960s, all of them had to allow folks, regardless of the color of their skin, right? So these were buildings that were not just new housing. They were new housing that had those people, that had other people moving in, and there was nothing Californians could do with the Rumford Open Housing Act when that passed in 1963. Well, what did we do? 1 year after the Rumford Open Housing Act, at the same time that we're having a statewide campaign to reinstate discrimination on the basis of race in units in buildings exactly like these dingbats, well, we upped our parking minimums just a little bit more here in Los Angeles to 1.5 spaces per unit. You may think, well, they need the parking, right? You need the parking. What? You just need a little more parking. Well, guess what? That functionally ended the mass production of dingbat apartments. Because if you're an architect now and you get this piece of land, you know, and you're like, okay, well, you can still only provide 8 parking spaces. And before, with 8 parking spaces, you could provide 6 units. Now, with 8 parking spaces, you can only provide 4, right? Suddenly, it no longer works, or 5. Like, it doesn't work. It doesn't pencil the way that it used to. So we see the end of the mass production of dingbat apartments as a result of just what might seem just like a little bit of an increase in the amount of parking spaces per unit, but functionally means that it does no longer make sense financially for folks who are willing to create tons of new, relatively affordable housing throughout the city. No longer works. It no longer makes sense. In 1968, we have the passage of the federal Fair Housing Act, which explicitly barred discrimination in housing accommodations on the basis of race. However, this bill has been described as the most filibustered bill in the history of the U.S. Senate. And it only had the filibuster dropped or overridden upon the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. It had been filibustered for years, and once he was assassinated, 1 week later, it finally moved through the Senate. And in 1968, only 11% of those Federal Housing Administration mortgages, those federally backed mortgages I told you about, only 11% had gone to lower and middle class neighborhoods. That meant 90% of our massive federal investment and subsidy of housing across the United States had gone to upper income neighborhoods, which, as you can tell from those redlining maps, were almost exclusively all white. So we had this billions and billions of dollars of subsidy and federal investment in housing that was exclusively available only to white people for 30 years. 30 years. So I want to tie a few things together as we sort of were making this shift, right? We're seeing this shift with the Fair Housing Act finally passing in 1968. It's no longer legally allowed to discriminate on the basis of race in housing anywhere in the country. We start to see things start to shift, start to change. And one of the things I would observe here for folks is the California Environmental Quality Act, signed into law by that same governor who certainly loved to discriminate on the basis of race in housing. Now, CEQA at first only applied to large municipal projects, but within just a couple of years, it applied to everything. Anything new construction had to go through CEQA. And since that time, for generations, it has been used and abused to curtail new housing construction across the state, particularly in city centers. Not so much out on the fringes, but definitely within city centers. CEQA has been used over and over and over again to stop the construction of new housing. And we started changing our zoning codes within the city of LA. I mean, I don't know if we started, but we were definitely using them to constrict. And the city council president in 1973, Councilmember John Gibson, chastised his fellow council members with a huge zoning update that was occurring and on the west side of LA, where they were increasing the minimum lot size. And he says, what you're doing exactly, and I think you know it, is instead of giving people a chance to move around the city and be able to buy a single residential lot, you've decided the house has to be on a larger lot, which makes it therefore more expensive. And you've made it impossible to do anything but just make the ghetto larger. That's exactly what you've done. So he's chastising his fellow city council members for increasing minimum lot sizes. Remember when I said earlier about single family zoning just means no matter the lot size, you can only have one house on it. They said, well, in this part of LA, you can no longer put a house on a lot size that's, whatever, 5,000 square feet. It has to be 10,000, or it has to be 20,000 square feet. It has to be bigger and bigger. In other words, it's got to be that much more expensive, because the most expensive part of a new home in a single family community is the land. It's not the home, it's the land. So then we have President Nixon, who, as you may recall, I was telling you earlier how our federally subsidized housing was, our federal public housing was segregated on the basis of race. Well, guess what? No longer possible once we passed the Fair Housing Act in 1968. It's no longer, you can no longer segregate on the basis of race, and we start to see this integration happening, and it's changing the face of what is allowed in public housing, right? Federally public housing that used to be whites only is no longer whites only. And just so happens, I would say not coincidentally, just a couple years later, that President Nixon says, yep, we're no longer going to be federally funding public housing. And we have this era, what is called urban renewal, where we're just scrapping and scraping neighborhoods right off the map throughout the country. You can find this in every single American city. And our biggest example here in Los Angeles is this community that I've shown you on this slide. It does not exist anymore. It was redlined because it was so heterogeneous. had folks of all different races, all different ethnicities. This is Bunker Hill. Bunker Hill was one of LA's very first neighborhoods, one of its very first communities in the late 1800s. This is what ended up becoming of Bunker Hill. We cleared the whole thing to build the Civic Center, the Music Center, LADWP, the County Hall of Administration, the Walt Disney Concert Hall, you name it. There is the new facility that's just about to open across from the concert hall, new apartment and hotel complex. That's one of the last legacy properties from this wholesale clearing that we did of Bunker Hill 50 years ago. We not only cleared all the homes up Bunker Hill, we leveled the hill. We actually leveled the hill. There's a couple of these homes you can see in the lower right hand of this slide. They've been moved to the Southwest, or not Southwest Museum, I'm going to forget the name of it. It's a Heritage Museum, I think. It's just off the Gold Line near Highland Park, where there's about 7 or 8 sort of classic LA homes. These are a couple homes that were preserved and are now, you can walk through them over there. But otherwise, we tore everything down. Why? Because it was redlined. Why? Because it was mixed races and ethnicities and incomes of folks in Bunker Hill. 1977, we finally say these maps are no longer legal. But it was 40 years of redlining maps that determined where you could get federally backed mortgages throughout the country and here in Los Angeles. We finally made it. We finally said you can no longer discriminate on the basis of race and housing. Literally just got rid of the redlining maps in 1977. And what do we do here in California? We passed Proposition 13 in 1978. Now, it's important to note that almost every homeowner in California at the time was white. Not all, but almost all were white. Because for generations, that was required. That was the only way you could purchase a home in California. And Prop 13 applied only to existing homeowners, right? So it was essentially locking in a permanent financial benefit for an almost exclusively white community across the state of California. And it is still the law of the land. It is often described as the third rail of California politics, because any attempt to even touch Prop 13 will be met immediately with resistance and will not go anywhere. And here in Los Angeles, just a few years after that, thanks to the leadership of Councilmember Zev Yaroslavsky, we passed Proposition U in 1986, which was largely seen as a reaction to some of the buildings that got constructed along the top of this slide, the West Side Pavilion on the upper left, the Fujita Building in Encino on the center upper part, and the Beverly Center in West LA in the upper right. And what Proposition U did was immediately downzone every single thoroughfare in the city of Los Angeles. It wiped the opportunity for nearly 1 million apartments right off the map, completely gone. Now, there's some things that have happened since, but that has been the law of the land. It is still on the books. Proposition U is still on the books, still applies across the city. So this is to demonstrate here what I've meant by constriction of that era from the mid-1960s to the mid-1980s. We saw zoning changes like the increased parking minimums I described around the dingbats, reduced height limits, limiting maximum densities, increasing the amount of yard that's required in buildings, the amount of setbacks that are required, the Proposition U that I mentioned that passed in 1986. Our zone capacity in the city of Los Angeles was 10 million residents in 1960. It went down to 3.95 million by 1980. So in 1960, when you could still discriminate on the basis of race in housing, we allowed a lot more housing to get built, but we had rules around how it could be segregated. But as those rules went away and you could no longer segregate, well, what do? We downzoned the heck out of our city. And I mean the heck out of our city. And we have made it near impossible to increase that zone capacity since then over the last 40 years. The one change that we have made since then is Measure JJJ, which the voters approved 6 years ago. It is the one and only time in our city's history where we voted in the affirmative to increase the amount of housing we allow in our city. The one and only time. And it has allowed for more housing in those areas that I mentioned that Prop U downzoned, so long as they're adjacent to transit. But it is only in the city of Los Angeles. It does not apply outside the city of LA. And it has been challenged in the courts. Thankfully, those challenges have been pushed back, and they successfully. But Measure JJJ is the one and only time that Angelenos have voted in support of more housing in our city. So let's come into our present, right? Let's shift from just our history to our present. Of our existing housing units in the city of Los Angeles, the existing housing we have here today, this shows by decade when those homes were built. And you'll see here, I think a lot of folks think we're building so much housing today. We're building less housing today than we ever have. Let's be clear. We have never built less housing in the last 110 years than this last decade. We're doing worse than we ever have in terms of constructing new housing. And frankly, that's been true for decades. So the vast majority of our housing is more than 40 years old. And frankly, most of our housing was built at a time when we allowed discrimination on the basis of race of our housing in an era of redlining. So like the patterns that were created in over decades of explicitly and implicitly racist housing policies, those patterns persist. They remain because we have made it so difficult to build any more housing over the last 40 years. And going back to the redlining map for the LA Basin, I mentioned we'd talk a little bit more about our freeways. This is our freeway network overlaid on this redlining map. And it doesn't take too long to figure out that we built a lot of freeways along and through our redlined communities. They almost trace redlined communities to a T. As an activist once said, and I'll quote, sort of bungle the quote here, but they said that, of all the freeways that were planned across Southern California, they only built about 60% of them. But in East LA, they built 100% of the freeways they planned to build. As stated in the October 2020 Vanderbilt Law Review, quote, in LA, the highway system was designed to serve the dual purposes of segregation and isolation. Highways in Los Angeles worked to hide the brutal violence of racial segregation and also helped to maintain it. So you might, if you look over on the west side where the 405 cuts north from the 10 freeway up over to the hills, you have an area on the one side that is blue and the area on the left that is red. And the freeway is intentionally cut right down the line that separates those communities to segregate the red line community from the blue line community. These were by design. Every turn of the freeway, every little shift one direction or another through the city environment, that was a political decision to put that freeway in that spot. These are not coincidental things where the freeways are located. And further, just showing these blue stars, this is where the public housing that we have in LA exists today, almost exclusively in formerly redlined communities. But even more to drive home the point here, formerly redlined communities, they're hotter than formerly green and blue line communities. In LA, by about 7 degrees on average. So a day like today, where we're in the low 80s, our formerly red line communities may be up around 90, where our green and blue line communities are in the low 80s. They are less safe for people walking, biking, taking transit, or driving. Because what did we do with our green and blue line communities that were up in the hills or a little bit harder to access? We widened the streets through our red and yellow line communities to make it easier for folks to drive quickly through them to get to their neighborhoods in the green and blue line communities. So we have wider, faster, busier streets in our former red and yellow lined communities, which makes them less safe for people walking, biking, and taking transit or driving. Our formerly red line communities have smaller parks that are more crowded than our formerly green and blue line communities. Policing. a 2020, sorry, our formerly redlined communities are over-policed when it comes to social control and under-policed when it comes to emergency services. And policing responds to and reinforces segregated landscapes. So policing is one of the mechanisms that reinforces those historical segregated landscapes that are the result of decades of redlining policies. A 2020 study found homes in black neighborhoods are appraised at lower values than similar homes in white neighborhoods by an average of 23%. And that gap is wider today than it was 40 years ago. So when I said our housing policy is systemically racist and has been for a very long time and is getting worse, this is one of the ways we know it's getting worse. Because the only thing that explains the disparity in the appraisal of homes in majority white communities versus the appraisal of homes in majority black communities is the race. It's race. That's it. Homes having 23% less value in majority black neighborhoods than majority white neighborhoods. Whiter and wealthy neighborhoods have about 50% more greenery and urban canopy when compared with formerly red and yellow line communities. And March 2022 analysis of 202 cities, so this is not just LA, found a, quote, strong correlation between pollution levels today and historical patterns of redlining, end quote, from 80 years ago. So these things persist. They don't just persist, they define our communities today. Even COVID. Now this map is getting a little old, but the patterns have held ever since then. Which is two maps overlaid on each other. There's one that's showing areas shaded, areas from green to red, and another showing dots that are of different sizes, from very, very small to much bigger dots. The color shading, but from green to red, is showing you the Cal EnviroScreen, which is a measure of pollutants in communities. And the darker the red, the more polluted, air polluted the community. The darker the green, the less air polluted. We have some of the best air quality communities anywhere in the state, up around Santa Monica and the mountains there, the Palisades, and some of the worst air quality anywhere in the state in Central and South LA and the Southeast LA communities. And you can see the difference in terms of COVID prevalence. The dots show you the rate of COVID. They're not showing the total number of cases, they're showing the rate. In other words, in communities that have higher air levels of air pollution, they have much higher rates of COVID. They're seeing COVID at much higher rates than in communities with much better air quality. LA, of 221 metro areas, we are the 6th most segregated, and just as segregated today as we were 30 years ago, and more segregated than cities like Cleveland or Philadelphia. In the city, almost half of white households own their home compared to a fifth of black households. And black homeownership today across the country is almost the same as it was 50 years ago when the Fair Housing Act was first passed into law. And the gap between black and white homeownership today is larger than at any time in the last generation. This is a map which depicts individuals across the LA basin from the 2010 census. This hasn't been updated yet for the 2020 census. The blue dots show where a white person, each blue dot is indicating a white person, each green dot is indicating a black person, each red dot indicating a census designated Asian person, and each orange dot indicating a census designated Hispanic person. So the terminology and labels used by the census. And you can see across this map, the areas where there are blue dots, they tend to be more spread out. That's because they're spread out because they're in single family communities. The areas where there's orange dots tend to be much more clustered together. That's because those are Latino folks living in largely multi-family communities. There's areas of green dots that are more spread out, which are communities like Ladera Heights, Crenshaw, Inglewood, South LA, where there's green that are more spread out. Those are some of single family communities that are majority black communities. I think it's important to acknowledge that that is very true, that we have single family communities that are majority black communities here in Southern California. It is also the exception that unfortunately in many ways proves the rule across the country, because it is an exception, because it is so rare to find single families today which are majority Black communities. This is another thing that just popped up recently called the Opportunity Atlas. And I note this because even though I don't have the redlining map to sort of overlay here, I think it's important to see that basically you can almost pick out the redlining maps just looking at this, even just looking at the dot map here, where folks live. The Opportunity Atlas is basically looking at, for someone who is born into an area with a certain zip code, what is their income when they're 35 years old? And the bluer colors means their incomes are higher. The red colors mean their incomes are lower. And so basically you can see here the opportunity for folks based on where they are born in LA. And that central South LA areas, very lower opportunity relative to the west side, or even the Larchmont area in central Los Angeles. So I think it's important to just sort of tie this bow together about constriction, that the California Legislative Analyst's Office did an analysis that looked on this a few years ago, where they studied housing costs, and they came up with a conclusion that building less housing than people need drives high housing costs. In other words, there's not enough housing to meet the demand. May seem self-evident, but for some folks it's not, right? We say, well, there's still some vacant homes. We just need to put them in those vacant homes. We have moving on. We need some level of vacancy so that people have choices, so they have options, so that, you know, someone wants to charge them an arm and a leg for housing, they don't have to go there because it's the only place that's available to them. And when we have this era of constriction, the severe constriction that occurred over a 20-year span from the 1960s and 1980s, you know, some folks, they say, well, housing costs have always been higher in California than the rest of the country. Well, that you can see in the chart on the lower right. That's true. It's actually true. The black bars are the average housing price in California, and the light blue bars are the average housing price in the rest of the country. And you can see 1940, 1950, 1960, 1970, that housing costs in California are a little bit higher than housing costs in the rest of the country, but they're fairly in line with the rest of the country. I mean, they're not all over, they're not super higher, they're higher, but they're not super higher. That changes in 1980, shortly after we had passed Prop 13, locking in the financial advantage for existing homeowners and constricted the heck out of our state, out of our region, for the ability to create new housing. Our housing costs skyrocket, and they completely decouple from the rest of the country's housing costs, to the point where in 2015, our average housing price in the state of California, $450,000, the rest of the country about $180,000. If we stayed on track for the way that we had been for the decades before we constricted the heck out of housing around around the state, our number in 2015 was probably going to be shy of 250,000, not shy of 450,000. So that gives you some sense of just how important, how significant this constriction has been in terms of shaping our housing costs. Even more to the point, this is a study that looked at the 30 largest metropolitan areas in the country. So every one of the 30 largest metropolitan areas is on this chart. And this chart has two data points. On the left, it's showing you the median area housing costs as a percent of median area earnings. So in other words, some areas they pay you a lot more, but housing is also a lot more. So, you know, some areas they pay you a lot less, but housing's really cheap, right? So the percent of the housing costs as a percent of earnings in the area, that's what that is on the left. So if it's 50%, that means that if the median area earning is $100,000, the median area housing cost is $50,000. It's half of what the area earnings are. And the bottom line, the x-axis, is the ratio of housing, of population, of adult population to housing. It's literally only that. It is for every, you know, how many homes do you have for every person who lives in that area, right? So you can see it ranges from 1.9 on the left up to 2.3 on the right. So it's not a huge range even, right? It's the middle of it is 2.1, which means that there's 2.1 adults for every home in a community. Literally those two things. That's all this shows. And it is showing that it has a statistical significance, or an R squared of 0.89. For those people who are statisticians, that is huge. That is saying these two things are directly connected. That the amount of homes you have for people living in an area directly connects to how expensive the housing is for what people earn in that area. Period. End of story. And where's Los Angeles? We are all the way to the right. Yay, Los Angeles. We have the fewest homes for the number of people who live here of any of the 30 largest metropolitan areas. And we have the most expensive housing relative to our median incomes of any of the 30 largest metropolitan areas in the country. We are the worst in both categories. And if we wanted to get down to, say, where I've indicated here on this now with this line, all the way down to where we had, instead of 2.35 adults for every unit of housing, where we only had 2 adults for every unit of housing. For the people who live here today, right, so that we could get our housing costs down from about 60% of our median income to about 40% of our median income. If we wanted to do that in our LA metropolitan statistical area, we would have to build 1.2 million homes. I'm just going to restate that. This is not for new people. This is not for people who are going to move here because we added some jobs or whatever. It's for the people who are here right now, today. This is for people who are currently living in overcrowded housing, who are paying an arm and a leg, who are trying to make a living here in LA today. For them, for all of us, to have housing costs that average, instead of 60%, almost 60% of our average earnings, to down to 40% of our average earnings, we would have to build today 1.2 million new homes. So we have these conversations about housing. Oh, there's all this housing going here, there, whatever, right? But, so often it's tied into this idea of we're building housing for people who aren't yet here. That's ridiculous. We aren't building housing for the people who are here now. We're asking people to live in overcrowded conditions, in not safe or healthy conditions, because we are so obstinate about building new housing in LA right now, and we need to change that. I mentioned the California Environmental Quality Act under Ronald Reagan. It is today the tool that is used to fight new housing. 80% of CEQA lawsuits target new housing in cities. Almost 80%, 4 out of every 5 CEQA lawsuits targets housing. And the result of the environmental impact reports that are required under CEQA, according to the California Legislative Analyst's Office, that means it takes 2.5 years just to approve new housing when they require an environmental impact report. So our environmental law makes it easier to build housing out in the wildland urban interface, where we have wildfires going on like crazy, than it is to build housing in the middle of our cities, which are safer, where we already have the infrastructure to provide people with water, sewer, you name it, that power exists within the cities, versus building housing further and further and further out on the fringes. In terms of homelessness, which is a big reason I think a lot of people come to this conversation, we often hear about homeless folks as though, they are like crazy, they have substance abuse issues, they're mental illness issues. Well, the county looks at this question and has determined that 70% neither are mentally ill or have substance abuse issues. 70% of our homeless. Now, you may think, well, but that doesn't square with what I see in the street. That's because most of the homeless in our communities, you don't see. They're not on the street. They're living in cars. They're living in trailers. You don't see them because they're not on the street in a tent. And actually, the numbers of people who suffer from mental illness or substance abuse issues are not that much higher than our housed population. But guess what? Not having a roof over your head is a huge reason that it becomes difficult to deal with mental illness and substance abuse issues. And I mentioned previously our systemically racist housing policy. How do we know it's systemically racist? Here's another key data point that we can say the only way this is explainable is by racism, which is that the black share of our LA County population, 8%. The black share of our LA County homeless, 33%. There's nothing else that explains that besides race. That's it. And when we look at the causes of homelessness, the Harvard University Joint Center for Housing Studies looked at all 50 states, and they tracked the cost of housing and the numbers of people experiencing homelessness. And this is the chart showing all the states on a graph. And they found a pretty clear correlation that the higher costs of housing lead to more folks experiencing homelessness. It's not quite as clear a correlation as we see with, say, the cost of housing relative to the number of people, how many people per home that you have in a community that we saw in that previous chart, but it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear. And I brought up that about, this isn't working. Dorothy Walker is the founder of the American Planning Association, did an op-ed a couple years ago online where she talked about, what we've created in terms of our planning structures. And she says the very people who support progressive change elsewhere, they use local control of land use to prevent structural change in their communities that would advance the cause of racial justice. So folks who are saying Black Lives Matter, all are welcome here. Everyone's welcome here. Also saying, but not that building, not that apartment building. I don't want that, but everyone's welcome here. Well, sure, everyone's welcome here so long as you can afford, whatever it costs nowadays to live here. She goes on to say that as long as the people who own land and are already housed have total control over growth and change in their communities, we will never achieve true racial justice and social equity. She's very clear about this. And she's the founder of the American Planning Association. And we hear a lot of folks, saying developers make so much money, etc. I just offer this one little chart here, which was done in looking at the state of Oregon, but this holds everywhere across the country. The homeowner equity gains they're enormously greater than the earnings we see for developers. So the folks who are benefiting from this environment, they're homeowners. They're folks who have the single family homes, who in many cases have been in communities for a great deal of time, are passed down wealth from prior generations who benefited from those federal policies, from the racial discrimination that allowed folks who were primarily on the basis of their race were able to earn income for generations that they then passed on, and they're continuing to make huge equity gains while everyone else is suffering. And when I say suffering, that's actually an intentional choice. This is a map of the city of LA, pink and blue color-coded, showing the pink areas is designated for single-family homes or banning multifamily housing, and the blue areas allowing multifamily housing. And this shows you a couple numbers. So that's the Encino Hills, I've got 82.6 to 87.8 and $202,000. This is the average lifespan for someone from that community, 82.6 to 87.8 years. And the average household income, $202,000. The upper right is showing in the North San Fernando Valley near CSUN. The average lifespan is a little shorter. The average household income is significantly less. The lower left is the Wilshire Condo Canyon right near UCLA. Average lifespan up mid-80s. Average household income, $122,000. Lower right-hand side is Westlake MacArthur Park Community. The average lifespan in the mid-70s of years, and the average household income, $28,000. The single greatest determinant of someone's lifespan is the zip code where they live. The single greatest determinant. If you want to know how long someone's going to live, the best way to find out, the first thing you want to find out is where they live. And we have determined where people could live for decades, previously based on explicitly and then implicitly racist policies, and then exclusionary zoning to cut out any opportunities for folks to live in these communities where lifespans are longer. They have better air quality. We've only allowed people with higher incomes so they have better access to resources, etc. We've given them more resources. They have better urban canopy. They have better temperatures, etc., etc. So to sort of wrap that up, the single-family housing or multifamily housing ban has been a very successful affordable housing program for those who were able to participate, which for decades was exclusively white folks. With the federally backed lending, wealth building opportunities, tax write-offs, and then Prop 13, which then shifted the burden for our cities and our state from using property taxes, which were largely impacting wealthier folks, to sales taxes. So we've seen a shift at our local and state government to sales taxes and also income taxes at the state level, which the state, to its credit, has done a very good job in terms of making those more progressive. But otherwise, we have this significant shift from property taxes to sales taxes, which shifts the tax burden responsibility for providing government services from wealthier homeowners to lower income renters. You know, and we also hear folks say, well, you know, it's housing, it's where we're gentrifying or whatever. What's this chart is to show what's in a home's value. I mentioned the land, and that's what it shows. If you look at Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco, San Jose, the yellow areas, that's the land value over the last decade, increasing year over year over year. The blue is the structure value, the building that's on top of it. And in every single case, outside of Bakersfield, Fresno, Sacramento, San Bernardino, in every single case in our major urban centers, it's the value of the land that is driving the increases in costs for housing in our cities. So we can't keep doing this, though. This isn't going to work. This is not the solution to our housing crisis, is to keep gobbling up deserts and forests and farmland to build single-family communities further and further out from our city centers. So I said we'd go through a few more things and then we'll have time for questions. So I want to make sure we do that. We've got about 5 more minutes here of my presentation. The first being, you know, LA County as a region, we are as a county, we have a population of 10 million, which would make us the 8th largest state. The 10 smallest states across the United States, if we combined them, it'd still be fewer people than live in our one county. So we have a very large population county. And this governance, which I have to update this slide now because everything's been redistricted, but this is just to show our governance is really kind of all over the place, right? We have 88 cities. Every one of those cities has their own city council, has their own planning and zoning rules. City of LA has 15 council districts. We have, 12 congressional districts. We have 8 or 9 state senate districts. We have 15 or 16 assembly districts. We have 5 county supervisors districts. Our governance is all over the place. So when you want to change something to make it more possible for more people to live here, who's responsible? Who do you talk to? Where do you go to change it? It varies from place to place to place. So we have a theory of change here at Abundant Housing LA. That abundant housing is key to everyone having a home they can afford, communities being more livable and sustainable, and that we need to address the urgent climate crisis. And in those 3 things in our theory of change, on the first point about everyone having a home they can afford, affordable housing programs have a role as a supplement to broader changes that facilitate more private housing construction. But as the legislative analyst 2015 housing report also concludes, policies have to be changed to allow more private housing construction in coastal urban areas. We are starting to see that shift happening at the state level, the state requiring cities and counties to allow more private housing construction in coastal areas, but it is not without a huge amount of pressure and pushback from those communities. In terms of the second point about being more livable and sustainable, this was a study done just a few years ago. You may have seen this on social media. It pops up every so often. Done by the Smart Prosperity Institute in Canada, which looked at the cost per household for a bunch of different municipal services. And in every single instance, the cost is higher in a suburban environment where homes are further apart than it is in an urban environment where people live more closely together. I think this is an important point because one of the things we often hear in pushback when, to infill housing is, well, where will the water come from? Where will the power come from? So to my first point about we just need housing for people who are already here. They're already using the water. They're already here. They're already using the water. So building the housing for them doesn't get rid of the water they're using, right? But to this point specifically, if we don't build the housing infill, and we're going to build the housing at some point, it's going to go out on the fringes. And that means we're going to have to send the water that much further out. We're going to have to bring the sewage in from that much further out. We're going to have to send the power supply that much further out. We're going to have to build that many more roads that much further out. That's what these numbers are capturing in the cost annually per household for a home in a suburban versus an urban environment, where it is more than double the cost in a suburban environment, which is one of the things that our cities are grappling with, where they are continually facing higher and higher costs because folks are living further and further out. We're having to send water further out. We're having to send power further out. We're having to deal with, municipal costs that are encountering, the costs associated with people further and further out relying on these services. And in terms of our third point about our theory of change, addressing the urban climate crisis. There was an article that Brookings had just a couple months ago where they said, simply put, the U.S. cannot reach its greenhouse gas reduction targets if our urban areas continue to grow as they have in the past. After decades of sprawl, the U.S. has the dubious honor of being a world leader in both building-related energy consumption and vehicle miles traveled per capita. So we have a responsibility here, not just to our communities and our residents, but to our planet, to our future generations, to create more housing in communities where the opportunities exist for people to walk, to bike, to take transit, to not have to hop in a car for every single thing, to go pick up, a bag to pick up a gallon of milk or pick up diapers for the kids. So our policy approaches at Abundant Housing LA are 4 key things. Want to legalize more homes, make them easier to build, fund affordable housing and end homelessness, and strengthen renters' rights. Those are the 4 key things that we are advocating for at Abundant Housing LA. So if you're thinking of getting involved, if any of this is sort of sparking with you, and I see there's a few things in the chat, so I'll check those out in a minute. Here's some ways you can do that. You can become a member. You can donate. You can follow us on socials. We're at Abundant Housing on Instagram and Twitter, on Facebook.com at Abundant Housing LA. You can volunteer with local chapters, city and community meetings. Jaime Del Rio is our field organizer. You can email him at jaime@abundanthhousingla.org. And that's what I got for you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being attentive. I will now turn it back over for Q&A.
Right. Thank you so much, Luke. So why don't we have one question in the Q&A from Chris. He comments that everyone always notes Prop 13 as a lost cause in terms of overturning. Many say because you can price out services for those who can afford them, i.e. education, parks, and public services, to other areas, and not being forced to take options where you live. But many in public admin have constantly noted we need to readdress and renegotiate public funds that our county, city, and school districts compete over, and where the money is actually going to improve our communities, essentially stopping the competition over taxes and funds. What can we do to renegotiate public funds, and is repealing Prop 13 really an end-all be-all?
Wow. Thank you, Chris. You are a student of Proposition 13, and I appreciate that. So, I know Prop 13 in the context of the housing conversation because how hugely significant it is as not just a part of our housing history, but our housing present, right? There are people who are hugely impactful and influential in the housing conversation today, who show up to those community meetings like the one I showed from the Bronx Community Board 10, who have owned their homes for 30 or 40 years and are paying little to nothing in property taxes thanks to Prop 13. But if you or I wanted to buy a home in that community, we'd have to bankrupt ourselves, or we'd have to be earning 3 or 4 times the median income in our region in order to be able to afford it. But the folks who are getting to decide where the housing gets built, who are weighing in with the most influence, are the ones who have the least value at stake in terms of what they're actually paying to be a participant in the community. So it has created some very disparate outcomes and incentives in our housing conversation. Now, in terms of repeal versus not repeal of Prop 13, I think there's been some folks who have ventured into this water, who have been interested in this conversation. We saw an effort just a couple of years ago to do what is called a split roll, to allow for commercial properties to have no Prop 13 no longer apply to them, versus residential properties would continue to have Prop 13, and that effort failed in the state of California, the ballot box. But what that would have done is, for a lot of commercial properties, like, they don't change hands at any given point where then the property is reassessed, as it would be in, like, if you were to buy a home, that it would be reassessed in its value, and the Prop 13 would take effect with the new purchase of the home. A lot of commercial properties have never had that, so they still have the property assessment from 1978. Because of the way that commercial property changes hands versus the way that residential property changes hands. But even that failed at the ballot box, and that's why folks say it's a third rail. No, don't touch it, because it's never going to have any chance to be overdone or taken out. So what do we do instead? We do things like Prop 90, I think it's 98, which requires a portion of all state general fund revenues to go to education. We have other ballot measures that have essentially carved out, well, you've got to put money here, and you've got to put money there, and you've got to put money there. Right now, we have a huge budget surplus in the state of California. We've never seen anything like this that we have this year. And the ballot measures require that it has to be spent this year. So that is, one more example of, because of the way because of Prop 13 and all of the after effects of it, where people sort of grabbed onto, like, well, we've got to fund this, we've got to fund that, we can't touch Prop 13, but we got to do this, we got to do that. We now have this environment where very little can actually be determined by the legislature that we send to Sacramento every couple of years, because it's so prescribed, because of the way that Prop 13 sort of just unfurled this sort of beast, if you will, in municipal financing, forcing the hand of what was available in resources. And we have to try things like here in LA County, passing sales taxes, because we keep finding ourselves with not enough funding to pay for stuff. But what we're left with is we can't actually levy that on the properties which are accruing enormous amounts of wealth. Instead, we levy it on our renter class with the sales taxes that we rely on.
Okay. We have another question that's come in from Peter. He asks, do you believe the reason that Measure JJJ was passed is because LA is so car-centric?
No. I don't believe that Measure JJJ passed because LA is car-centric. I believe that Measure JJJ passed because it had an outstanding coalition of folks that included progressive activists, housing activists, and labor backing it. And that is what got it over the finish line. And I think, because what Measure JJJ does is say you can build taller, denser, closer to the property line, however, only if you provide some percentage affordable housing. It has actually resulted in the largest affordable housing program here in the city of Los Angeles that I think we've ever seen. From a city level, we've never seen anything that has been nearly. We are seeing thousands of new designated affordable units being constructed, with not a single, going back to what that planner said at the Bronx Community Board number 10, not a single dime of public subsidy to construct thousands of new designated affordable homes across the city of Los Angeles. But I would also note, it's just in the city of LA. So we're building transit. I work in transportation policy. We're building transit throughout LA County, right? Throughout LA County. What is Beverly Hills doing for the Purple Line subway that's going to be built there? What is Santa Monica doing about the Expo line that was constructed to Santa Monica? What are other cities doing where we're investing significant resources? What's Redondo Beach doing about the Green Line that goes to Redondo Beach? Right? Like, we have invested enormous amounts of money. We are building a subway right now, $6 billion subway to UCLA. And just a couple years ago, the city of LA designated as historic all of the central mid-Wilshire area along that subway corridor, except for right along Wilshire Boulevard and right along La Brea. So anywhere you want to build housing now, you're limited to just those corridors. Meanwhile, it is going to be the most accessible way to get to UCLA or downtown LA, anywhere in the entire region, when we have a housing crisis that, some hundreds of students, maybe even over 1,000 students at UCLA are homeless today, right? And we could be building housing that they could afford, that they could hop on the subway to get to UCLA in a few years. But because we designated a whole swath of the city as historic and said, you can't touch this, we can't actually build new housing there. So this is what we're doing over and over and over again. So JJJ, good on us for allowing some new housing to get built in a few designated areas. If we provide if a developer provides some designated affordable housing as part of that. But outside of that, we're still doing a great deal of work to make it harder and harder to build housing here in LA.
Thank you. We have a couple of comments in the chat as well. Chris says, I really resonated with the quote from the APA founder. The west side of Los Angeles is undergoing a community plan update, and many of the homeowners have stressed NIMBY attitudes because of the city has proposed lackluster increases in density. Los Angeles is more than just the west side, who largely dictates housing policy outcomes in our metro region.
Okay. Well, thank you for your activism, Chris. I appreciate that.
He's on it. And then John says JJJ passed because as an alternative to status quo or Measure S, it made for some production, but decidedly requires affordable housing. Without that affordable housing, it would have never passed.
I agree that without the inclusion, you're right, John, that if it didn't have that provision that I mentioned previously, that allowed for increases in density or height or whatever, reducing setbacks contingent on the provision of affordable housing, it never would have passed.
I have a question, actually. I'm wondering what you know about community land trusts. I'm hearing that seems like sort of almost like a buzz term in some circles. I don't know. What do you think about that, and how feasible is it to sort of use that as some sort of solution?
I don't know a lot about community land trusts. I will just own that, right? Mm-hmm. My understanding is what it intends to do is allow folks to purchase, like to pool wealth together to purchase the land that then they can build the housing on that, or the housing that's there, plus they can do whatever else with it. I would just note that so long as our zoning is as restrictive as it is, it does not matter how many people can buy a piece of land if you can still only build one house on it. And this is the thing that we have encountered in Los Angeles with Measure HHH, which was passed at the same time as we did JJJ, where we provided over $1 billion for the construction of new affordable housing here in the city of LA. And we're only seeing about 5,500 units come out of that. And one of the biggest issues they've encountered is how long it takes to get things approved and where they can get built. Because it is so dang difficult. So long as that chart, which showed the number of, we had a capacity of 10 million residents in the city of LA in the 60s, that dropped down to just shy of 4 million by 1980. So long as that holds in that fashion, we can throw billions of dollars at the housing issue. If it's still, as long as it's costing like it does now, almost $800,000 to build one new home in the city of LA, we are not going to get to a point where we can have abundant affordable housing. We have to make it much easier to build housing throughout the city. And the zone and community land trusts, great. Subsidizing, public funds to subsidize new housing, great. The state wants to throw, $50 billion at it, great. That'll get you a few thousand units across the state. Until we tackle this issue of where we have made it so difficult to build, we have created, we had a former president who talked about a wall a lot and walling people out. We have a wall. We have built a wall with our zoning code where we have made it impossible for people to build new homes, to create communities of multifamily homes throughout our region in all these kinds of exclusive communities, which have better air quality, lower temperatures, better access to resources, you name it. And we have walled them out. And so long as we allow that to persist, it doesn't matter how much money we throw at this. I mean, it matters. It's good to throw money at it, but we're going to continue to be throwing good money after bad.
Peter asks, is this why SB 9 includes the ability to subdivide parcels so that the larger lot sizes can be reduced?
Sure. I don't know if that's why. You know, SB 9, for those who are unfamiliar, which if you're in this conversation, I doubt that you are, but what SB 9 allows is for a single family parcel to be subdivided into two, and then each of those two can have a main home and an accessory dwelling unit. So in other words, a single family parcel could be subdivided into what would functionally be 4 homes. Not a 4-unit apartment building, by the way. This is not the same thing, right? You have to, if you subdivide the lot, that means it's 2 separate homes. And then if you have ADUs, those are also separate homes. So it's not like you can take a single family home and build a 4-unit apartment building on it by right. That's not what SB 9 allows. We are seeing SB 9 starting to have an impact in some communities, but very, very little. I mean, it is, the city of LA has itself found ways to try and continue to restrict where SB 9 can be applied by limiting its application in hillside communities, areas that are sort of the wildland interface, as they, you know, sort of broadly describe it. We'll see. I mean, I feel like SB 9 was a lot of noise and a lot of bluster and a lot of very strong feelings over what is functionally, you know, being pretty constricted in terms of what it can do. That's why we had a city up in the Bay Area where they designated themselves as a lion enclave or something. Like they were, you know, they were like a lion. There were lions in the area. They're like, well, we can't build new housing here because of the lions, right? This is what cities are trying all sorts of ways to make SB 9 not apply to them. So we'll see just how broadly it does ever really truly apply, but we're seeing that pushback because housing, just that's the way housing has always been.
We've got Kevin in the chat. He says he was moved. I'm sorry. He just moved here from.
I'll take either.
Yeah, he just moved here from Minneapolis, and felt pretty seen when you flashed that photo of the all are welcome sign next to change the 2040 plan. Do you have experience in talking to people who say they have progressive values, but then just don't get it when it comes to housing and density measures?
Yeah, a little bit. I wish I could say, and sorry, who's that? Was that Kevin?
Yes.
So no, I mean, I think that is really at the heart of the challenge here, and something that I don't have my presentation, but I will share with y'all because I've had some opportunities to talk with through other stuff that I'm involved with. I got a chance to talk with a number of folks who are running for office here in LA. We just had our big election on Tuesday. We'll see where that heads in November. But one of the things I shared with a lot of these Democratic politicians that I got a chance to talk to was the most important way, the strongest indicator for how a person will vote, Democratic or Republican. It's not race. It's not race. It's how densely populated the communities they come from. This is now borne out from the data that if you want it, that a black person living in a rural environment is more likely to vote Republican than a white person in a dense environment, right? It is the density of the population that is the strongest indicator of how liberal a person will be in their voting record. And you know, so you might think, well, people are self-selecting, right? Like people are choosing to live in more dense urban environments or whatever. We are creating the environments, right? We are the creators of our environments. And for people who care about the existence of a progressive movement for years to come, what I've said to elected officials, and this may seem a little esoteric, but this is my position on this, as someone who cares about Democratic Party politics for much of my life, and really wants there to be a strong, meaningful, substantial, progressive movement for decades to come. For anyone who's truly invested in that, we have got to make it easier and more possible for people to live in dense urban centers. Period. End of story. Because those are the folks that are going to sustain this progressive movement. We cannot continue to have policies right now where people who are moving into dense urban environments are displacing a lot of folks who are sort of more of our, like, you know, natural folks in the democratic environment, democratic movement, out to suburban environments, out to wherever, because that's going to actually shift a lot of those folks into more Republican voting patterns. Like, we're actually seeing the change from 2016 to 2020 in voting patterns. We saw cities move more toward Trump as they've gotten less dense, more segregated. Like, we have got to provide more opportunities for people to live in dense city urban environments if we care about the future of our progressive movement. That's what I would say to a progressive activist. Now, I don't know if that necessarily moves them, right? A lot of folks, it's like, oh, that's too, you know, I don't, you know, what do I know? Sure, whatever, 10, 15, 20. I'm worried about now, right? I care about now. And, you know, one of the things that I've also said or shared with folks who like that community meeting that you saw at the start of this presentation is, where do you think your kids are going to live? Where are they supposed to go? Right? There, for years, the idea was, I want my kids to be near me, you know, from someone who's growing older. I want my kids to be near me so I can take care of my grandkids and I can see them when I can, and we can. That's not happening anymore. That's not happening anymore. It's not possible, right? Because the places where people have been raised, the prices have gotten so expensive. We're like, well, go live somewhere else, right? Go live, you know, wherever else. And the last thing I would say to someone who cares about progressive stuff is, you know, oh, do you really want to say to that family with that trans kid, you have to go move to Texas? You have to go move to Florida because we're too full here in California? Is that really our progressive position? Is that, you know, LGBT kids, you know, sorry, you can't be here. You know, we had this whole thing last year with the U.S. withdrawing from Afghanistan, and the turmoil that resulted from that, and all these folks who were, you know, refugees that were created as a result of that. And here in LA County, we were like, you can come here. We want all these refugees here. Where are they going to come? Where are they going to come? You know, if we really truly care about these things, if we care about LGBT kids being able to live in a community that's accepting and welcoming and open and supportive, if we care about refugees from other parts of the world who need to have a home to be able to live a decent life and raise a family, then we have to make it possible. We can't just say we care about it. We have to make it possible. And that means we have to give a little something up. That means that maybe, you know, maybe there's a few more people on my street. Maybe it is a little hard to find a parking space. Maybe there's a little more traffic, but maybe a bunch more people are able to live a life that is now possible because I was willing to sacrifice a little bit to make it possible. That's how I would approach that question, Kevin. And I appreciate you asking, because I think it really is at the heart of what we deal with on this conversation every day.
Thank you for that. Thank you for those questions, and thank you for those answers, Luke. We've got about 5 minutes. If anyone wants to throw another question up, you know, here at the end, please do.
And I will share my the thank you screen one more time so that folks, if you want to shoot me an email or find me on Twitter. I'm not on Instagram. I do have an Instagram, but I don't do anything with it, so don't find me there. But if you want to find me on Twitter, send me an email. I'm happy to engage at any point. You know, I care a lot about this. I can't promise I'll get back to folks right away. I have a pretty busy life, but I do want to make sure that I engage with folks on these questions.
Yeah, and I'm a field organizer. I realized I didn't introduce myself when we started, but my name is Josh, and I'm a field organizer with Abundant Housing. And so you can also reach out to me if you have questions, want to know what our next sort of event or even Housing 101 is. I can give you all of that. Jamie, or Jaime, is actually now our director of organizing. He moved on up. So I am now a field organizer and feeling my way through this. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I really, really appreciate seeing the turnout and the questions. And big thanks to you, Luke. These are great presentations. And I feel like I learned something new every single time I see one. So Thank you to everybody. I hope y'all have a fantastic weekend. Oh, wait, something just came up. Okay, wait, we got one more question. Peter, from Peter, he says, it seems like the most powerful Angelinos are against building more affordable housing. So how do we get them on our side, especially in grassroots campaigns?
I mean, that's the question, right, Peter? You know, part of it is you just got to win. I mean, that's what we're starting to see up in Northern California. There was a guy named Matt Haney, someone I've known for years, actually, back when I did some stuff up in Northern California. Good person, just got elected to the assembly, ran a very pro-housing campaign. He just won handily, very strongly over an entrenched, like strongly, like progressively aligned person. But Haney's also progressive, but he was like pro-housing. The other guy was much more of the like typical, you know, don't feel great about new housing. We need it, you know, whatever the messaging is. And that's one way, right? We just gotta win in some of these things and really demonstrate that there is a movement that is successful. And I guarantee you start to see that happening here or there. All those cities I showed on the map, you start to see that shift occurring, right? When because they're all looking at each other. They all know each other. So they start, oh, wait, what's happening over there? That's happening here too? Oh, you know, they start to actually pay attention, and they start to see that shift happening, that groundswell happening. Part of it's telling stories. Part of it is, you know, it's just who are the people who live in these new things that are going up, right? Like, who are these folks? Like, what is it that we're doing that's providing the opportunities for folks to live in our communities? Telling our stories. You know, so much of the storytelling that happens points the finger at like the developer, right, or whatever. You know, the person who's, you know, new to here, doesn't understand what our community's like. And really, we need to be turning that into, you know, the challenge here is we have systems that have made it impossible, and we need to be part of the solution to changing that and getting people excited about we're gonna change what's been so difficult for so long. We're gonna be part of the solution for the first time that hasn't happened for generations. I think that's possible to get people excited about that. So those are, you know, I know those are a bit like, you know, whoo, whatever, but like, that's kind of where we're at, right? Like you just got to win, and you got to tell the story in a way that people really get it. It can't be statistics. It can't be, you know, whatever, numbers. It has to be telling a story about like, this is why this is important to me. This is why it's important for us. This is why it's important for our community.
I love that. And I think that storytelling is powerful. I think that can be very powerful. So thank you so much for that. Great question.
Thanks, Peter. All right, y'all. It's 2:00. Have a great day.
Have a good one, everybody. Thank you so much for coming.